Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Last night, I couldn't sleep, because what I'm about to tell you, it's real. Deep in Appalachia, there are things living in those mountains. Not animals, not quite human anymore either. They move on all fours. They don't speak, and they're watching. Today, you'll hear 7 true stories from people who saw them. People who ran for their lives, some made it out. The lucky ones, anyway. Before the nightmare begins, do me a favor, subscribe and hit like. Drop where you're from in the comments. I need to know I'm not alone after reading these. Ready? Take a deep breath, because once you hear these stories, every shadow in the woods will feel different. Let's start. I'm 28 years old, and I work as a paramedic for the Rural Ambulance Service out of Asheville, North Carolina. The job pays decent enough, but honestly, I'm pulling double shifts most weeks trying to chip away at my medical school debt. Used to be a combat medic in the Army, so the remote emergency calls don't really faze me like they do some of the other guys. Most of the time, anyway. The thing about working emergency response in the Smoky Mountain foothills is that you get used to driving places that barely qualify as roads, finding houses that GPS has never heard of, and dealing with people who've been living the same way for generations. It's good work, meaningful work, but it can wear on you after a while. Especially the calls that come in after midnight, way out in the hollers where cell service cuts out and you're on your own until backup can find you. I'd been doing this job for about 3 years when the Henderson call came in. October of last year, around 2:30 the morning. I was wrapping up paperwork from an earlier call when dispatch crackled through my radio with coordinates that made me check the GPS twice. 15 miles past the last paved road, up in the mountains where most folks don't even have street addresses, just family names and landmarks that go back generations. The 911 call had come from someone claiming to be at the Henderson farm. Multiple family members injured in what the caller described as an animal attack. The voice on the recording was strained, kept cutting out with static, but you could hear the panic underneath. Dispatch had tried calling back twice but couldn't get through. That wasn't unusual for that area. Cell towers are sparse, and mountain weather plays hell with signals. What made this call different was that I'd been out to the Henderson place before, maybe 6 months earlier, for a farming accident. Old mountain family, been working the same land for 4 generations. The grandfather, Samuel Henderson, had caught his hand in some equipment and needed stitches. Nice people, kept to themselves mostly, but they'd been nothing but polite and grateful for the help. The drive out there took almost 40 minutes on winding mountain roads that got progressively worse the further I climbed. My ambulance's headlights carved through darkness so thick it felt solid, and the October air had that sharp bite that warned winter was coming early. I'd made this drive hundreds of times to different homesteads, but something felt off about tonight. Maybe it was the complete absence of other vehicles. Usually you'd see at least a couple of pickup trucks heading home from late shifts at the lumber mill or the quarry. The radio had been quiet since I'd left the main road. Backup was handling a multi-car accident down near Brevard, so it was just me for the initial response. Standard protocol for rural calls: get there, assess the situation, call for additional units if needed. The EMT training keeps you focused on the immediate medical needs, not whatever caused the injuries in the first place. That's for the sheriff's department to worry about. As I got closer to the Henderson property, I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. Fresh tire tracks in the mud beside the road, but no vehicles anywhere. The tracks looked like they belonged to at least 2 different trucks, maybe 3, all heading away from the farm. That struck me as strange. If there'd been an animal attack serious enough to warrant multiple ambulances, why would people be leaving? The Henderson farmhouse sat about a quarter-mile back from the road, connected by a gravel drive that wound between old-growth pines. From the road, the place looked completely dark. No porch lights, no glow from windows, nothing. During my previous visit, Mrs. Henderson had mentioned they always kept the front porch light on, said it was a family tradition going back to when her great-grandfather first built the house. I pulled up close to the front steps and grabbed my equipment bag, calling out as I approached the porch. "Emergency medical services, this is paramedic Chen responding to your 911 call." Nothing. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural. No dogs barking, no night sounds from the forest, not even wind through the trees. That's when I noticed the blood trail. It started on the front porch steps, dark stains that looked fresh under my flashlight. The trail led around the side of the house toward a large barn about 50 yards away. My radio crackled with static as I tried to reach dispatch, but I couldn't get a clear signal. The mountains have dead zones everywhere, but the timing felt wrong. Following protocol, I approached the barn slowly, calling out again. "Hello, paramedic Chen here. I'm responding to your emergency call." My voice echoed strangely in the darkness, like the sound was being absorbed by something I couldn't see. The barn doors were standing open, and my equipment was picking up vital signs from inside. Heart rates, breathing patterns, definitely human, definitely alive. But when I called out, nobody answered. The silence stretched on until I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice calling from the tree line beyond the barn, my own voice, clear as day, asking for medical assistance, in exactly my tone, my inflection, my speech pattern. But I was standing right here, and my mouth wasn't moving. I'd heard about combat stress causing auditory hallucinations, but this was different. This was perfect. Every detail of my voice was exact, down to the slight rasp I get when I'm tired. Someone was mimicking me, but it wasn't just mimicry, it was flawless reproduction. Inside the barn, I found the Henderson family. All 5 of them. Samuel, his wife Margaret, their adult son Daniel, and Daniel's 2 kids. They were conscious, but severely traumatized, huddled together in the far corner like they were trying to make themselves as small as possible. The injuries were unlike anything I'd seen in 3 years of emergency response work. Claw marks and bite wounds, but they were too precise. Too surgical. Animal attacks are messy, chaotic. These looked almost deliberate, like something had been very careful not to cause fatal damage. The family was conscious and coherent, but they kept pointing toward the forest and whispering about the thing that copied us. The children had been drawing pictures with sticks in the dirt floor. Crude sketches of what looked like their grandfather, but with something wrong about the proportions. The figure was too tall, arms too long, face not quite right. When I asked about the drawings, little Sarah, maybe 8 years old, looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. "It looked like Grandpa Robert," she whispered. "But Grandpa Robert died when I was 5. Margaret Henderson grabbed my arm as I began treating their wounds. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone who'd just survived an attack. "You have to understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It knew things, private things, family stories that Robert never told anyone else." As she explained what had happened, the pieces started forming a picture that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. According to the family, someone who looked exactly like Margaret's deceased father-in-law had appeared at their door around midnight, perfect in every detail, his voice, his mannerisms, even a small scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. They'd welcomed him inside, thinking somehow their patriarch had returned to them. He'd sat at the kitchen table and shared memories, told stories only the real Robert could have known. But something was off about the timing, the emotional responses. When Margaret hugged him, his skin felt wrong, too cool, too smooth, like it wasn't quite attached properly. The attack had started when young Sarah asked Grandpa Robert about heaven. The thing wearing her grandfather's appearance had tilted its head at an impossible angle and revealed what it really was. The family described teeth that were too sharp, eyes that reflected light like an animal's, and movements that were fluid but wrong, like watching someone move underwater. But the thing that terrified them most was how it had studied them during the attack. Not trying to kill, just observing their reactions, learning from their fear responses. When it heard my ambulance approaching, it had simply walked out the back door and disappeared into the forest. While I worked on their injuries, I found scattered clothing around the property that matched exactly what Robert Henderson had been buried in 3 years earlier. But the clothing wasn't old or weathered. It looked freshly made, like someone had perfectly recreated every detail from memory. The strangest discovery was a pile of what looked like human skin near the tree line. Flexible material that felt organic but shifted and moved when I touched it, like it was still alive. Under my flashlight, it had the texture of real skin, but the consistency of something that could be put on and taken off like a costume. That's when I heard my voice again, calling from deeper in the forest. "Hello, medical assistance needed out here." Same inflection, same professional tone I use when arriving at emergency scenes. But this time, there was something slightly wrong with the timing, like someone reading from a script they didn't quite understand. The family's security camera had captured the initial approach, but when I reviewed the footage later, the image distorted whenever it tried to record the creature's true form. You could see Robert Henderson walking up to the house clear as day, but certain frames showed something else entirely. Glimpses of elongated limbs and a face that was almost human but fundamentally wrong. I realized this thing had been studying human behavior, learning how to mimic us perfectly. But it didn't understand context or emotional authenticity. It could copy voices, appearances, even personal memories somehow, but it missed the subtle details that make us genuinely human. As I continued treating the family, I heard more voices calling from the forest. The dispatcher's voice requesting my location. Margaret Henderson asking me to come help us. Daniel's voice calling for his children. Each voice was perfect but wrong, like listening to recordings played back at slightly incorrect speeds. The creature was using everything it had observed as hunting tools. It had watched me work, listened to my radio communications, and was now attempting the same mimicry strategy that had worked on the Henderson family. But I'd learned something important from their experience. The thing was patient. It studied its targets extensively before approaching, learning speech patterns, mannerisms, personal information. But it couldn't replicate genuine emotional connections or understand the deeper context of human relationships. When my backup team finally arrived, I faced a terrifying realization. How could I be sure they were really my colleagues, and not more mimicry? The voices were perfect, the faces familiar, but something felt off about their responses to my situation report. I started asking questions that only my real partners would know. Details from previous calls we'd handled together, personal information we'd shared during long shifts. One of the paramedics failed to recognize a story about a Christmas call we'd handled 2 years earlier, something the real person would never forget. The thing wearing my colleague's face maintained the perfect physical appearance, but couldn't access the deeper memories and emotional connections that make us who we are. When I confronted it directly, it didn't deny or try to deflect. It simply tilted its head at that impossible angle and walked back into the forest. My real backup team arrived 20 minutes later, and this time I was certain of their authenticity. They knew everything they should know, responded emotionally, appropriately, and showed genuine concern for both my situation and the Henderson family's trauma. But as we prepared to transport the family to the hospital, we heard helicopter rotors approaching. The voice over the radio identified itself as medical evacuation, speaking in perfect pilot terminology and protocols. But none of us had called for air support. The creature was still out there, still learning, still adapting its hunting methods to counter every precaution we developed. It had observed our entire emergency response and was now attempting to insert itself into our evacuation procedures. We developed new communication protocols that night, code words and verification procedures that only real emergency responders would know. But even as we implemented these safeguards, I wondered how long it would take for the creature to adapt and overcome them. The Henderson family relocated to Asheville the following week. They couldn't bring themselves to stay on land where something had violated their sense of safety so completely. But moving didn't solve the problem. It just meant the creature now had new hunting grounds and had learned new methods from our encounter. Other emergency responders started reporting similar incidents, perfect mimicry of voices over radio communications, colleagues who appeared normal but failed verification protocols. The thing was spreading its influence, or maybe there were others like it. I still work as a paramedic, but I've developed strict protocols for verifying identity during emergency calls. I carry specific questions that only my real colleagues would know, and I never respond to calls alone in areas where mimicry encounters have been reported. To this day, I sometimes hear my own voice calling from tree lines when I'm working remote calls. The creature is still out there, still studying us, still perfecting its hunting techniques. And every time I respond to an emergency in the mountains, I have to wonder if I'm really helping people or walking into another carefully prepared trap. The worst part is knowing that somewhere out there, that thing is wearing someone else's face, speaking in someone else's voice, learning how to be a more perfect predator. And the only way to recognize it is to know people well enough to spot when something is pretending to be them. I never look at family photos the same way anymore. I'm 33 years old, and I've been running heavy equipment for about 20 years now. Started right out of high school when my dad got me on with his crew doing road work around eastern Kentucky. It's honest work, pays decent, and I'm good at it. Been operating excavators, bulldozers, all kinds of machinery since I could barely see over the controls. After my divorce 3 years back, I needed every hour of overtime I could get to keep up with child support for my 2 kids. That's how I ended up volunteering for the night shift on the Widow's Peak project, even when nobody else would touch it. The state was putting in a new stretch of interstate that would cut straight through some of the most remote mountain country you've ever seen. Widow's Peak was this massive ridge that jutted up from the valley floor, covered in old-growth forest that probably hadn't been touched since the Cherokee were here. The whole project was supposed to take 8 months, but we were already running 2 months behind schedule because of what the supervisors kept calling equipment malfunctions. I should have paid more attention to why 3 different night operators had quit without giving notice. Should have wondered why local contractors wouldn't bid on certain sections of the work. But I needed that overtime money. And when you've got kids depending on you, you don't ask too many questions about easy overtime nobody else wants. My name's Danny Rodriguez, and I've never been the superstitious type. Dad always taught me that mountains don't care about your feelings, and machinery doesn't run on wishes. You respect the equipment, you respect the terrain, and you do the work. Simple as that. I figured whatever was spooking the other operators was probably just the usual mountain weirdness, maybe some old mine shafts making strange noises, or wildlife getting displaced by the construction. Nothing an experienced equipment operator couldn't handle. The highway department had me running the big Caterpillar excavator on the night shift, mostly because the work we were doing involved a lot of blasting, and they wanted the heavy digging done when there wasn't as much traffic on the existing roads below. Made sense to me. I'd worked plenty of night jobs before, and I actually preferred it most of the time. Quieter, cooler, and you could focus on the work without supervisors breathing down your neck every 5 minutes. Widow's Peak itself was something to see, I'll give it that. During the day, it looked like any other Appalachian mountain. Thick forest, rocky outcroppings, probably full of deer and black bears. But at night, when I was up there alone with just the excavator's work lights cutting through the darkness, it felt different, bigger somehow, like it was watching you work. I remember thinking that was a stupid thought the first time it crossed my mind, but I kept having it anyway. The first couple weeks went smooth enough. I'd show up around 9 at night, fire up the cat, and spend 8 hours carving through rock and dirt to widen the cut we'd started during the day shift. The geological surveys showed solid limestone and shale, nothing too complicated. Blast a section during the day, then I'd come in and haul out the debris and dig deeper into the mountain face. Standard road construction, just in a place that felt like nobody had ever set foot before. But right from the start, there were little things that didn't add up. My GPS unit would spin like a compass near a magnet whenever I got within about 50 yards of the deepest part of the cut. Radio communication with the base station got scratchy and full of static the closer I worked to the mountain face. I figured it was just the rock formations interfering with the signals. Limestone can do weird things to electronics sometimes. The excavator itself started acting up around the 3rd week. Nothing major at first, just little glitches that didn't make much sense. The hydraulics would hesitate for a second when I tried to swing the boom, like the machine was thinking about whether it wanted to obey the controls. The engine would stumble occasionally, even though I'd just had the fuel system serviced. My headlights would dim and flicker when I was working near certain sections of the rock face, but they'd work fine everywhere else. I started keeping a notebook of the problems, thinking maybe there was some kind of pattern I could show the mechanics. But when I looked back at my notes, the malfunctions seemed to cluster around the deepest excavations, the places where we were cutting furthest into the mountain itself. That's when I started noticing that some of the rock we were blasting through wasn't quite what it should have been. The geological surveys had been pretty detailed, but they apparently missed some things. When we blasted through what was supposed to be solid limestone, we kept finding hollow spaces behind the rock faces. Not natural caves exactly, but chambers that had been carved out by something. The shapes were too regular, too deliberate to be natural erosion. And some of the rock formations themselves looked like they'd been arranged, not just deposited by ancient seas. I remember the night I first found the fossils that didn't belong. I was hauling a bucket load of blasted stone over to the dump site when I noticed something weird in the rubble. Mixed in with the normal limestone chunks were pieces of rock with impressions that looked almost like scales, but bigger than anything that should have been in Kentucky limestone. Some of them were the size of dinner plates, with a pattern that didn't match anything I'd ever seen in pictures of ancient sea creatures. That same night, I started hearing the sounds. At first, I thought it might be the mountains settling after the blasting. Rock formations can shift and groan for hours after you disturb them with explosives. But these sounds were different. They came from deep inside the mountain, and they had a rhythm to them that didn't sound geological. More like breathing. If something the size of a freight train could breathe. I mentioned it to my supervisor the next day, but he just laughed it off. Said mountain work always made people hear things, especially at night when you're tired and running loud equipment. He wasn't wrong about that. I'd worked plenty of mountain jobs where the wind through rock formations could sound like voices, or shifting debris could sound like footsteps. But this was different. This had purpose behind it. The sounds got stronger every night. Low-frequency rumbles that I could feel through the seat of the excavator, vibrations that seemed to answer the noise of my digging. When I'd swing the bucket into a new section of rock face, something deep in the mountain would respond with a sound like a landslide in slow motion. When I'd shut down the engine for my brake, I could hear massive movement somewhere below and behind the cut, like something immense was shifting position in chambers I couldn't see. By the fourth week, I was finding evidence that something was actively interfering with the work. Every morning, when the day crew showed up, they'd find that sections I'd excavated the night before had been filled back in, not with loose dirt and debris, but with rock that had been fitted back into place so perfectly you could barely see the seams. The day supervisor started blaming me for not digging deep enough, but I knew what I'd excavated. Somehow, every night's work was being undone by morning. That's when I started paying closer attention to what was happening to my equipment between shifts. I'd park the excavator in exactly the same position every night, with the boom and bucket in the same configuration. But when I came back the next evening, the machine would be facing a different direction, or the tracks would be positioned where I definitely hadn't left them. Little things, but consistent. Like something was examining the equipment while I wasn't there. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in October. I'd been working a particularly deep section where the blasting had revealed what looked like a natural chamber behind the rock face. My job was to clear out the debris and see how far back the hollow space extended. The excavator's lights couldn't penetrate very far into the opening, but I could tell it went back a lot further than the geological surveys had indicated. I was reaching the bucket into the chamber to pull out loose rock when I felt resistance that shouldn't have been there. Not the resistance of hitting solid stone, but something that gave way under pressure and then pushed back. Like I'd touched something soft and alive. I pulled the bucket back and aimed both work lights into the chamber. What I saw didn't make any sense at first. The walls of the chamber weren't natural rock formation. They were smooth, curved, with a texture that looked almost organic. And they were moving, expanding and contracting in a slow, steady rhythm that matched the breathing sounds I'd been hearing for weeks. That's when I realized the chamber wasn't empty. It was full of something that had been living inside Widow's Peak for longer than I wanted to think about. Something massive enough that the chamber I was looking into was probably just a small part of it. The curved walls weren't walls at all. They were skin, or hide, or whatever you call the outer covering of something that had grown large enough to hollow out the inside of an entire mountain. I sat in that excavator for maybe 10 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The logical part of my brain kept insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was some kind of underground cave system that created optical illusions. Maybe the work lights were playing tricks on my eyes after weeks of night shifts. But the longer I watched, the more obvious it became that I was looking at a living creature that was so large I couldn't comprehend its actual size. The thing moved again while I was watching, a slow undulation that sent vibrations through the ground and into the excavator's chassis. One of my work lights flickered and went out, but the remaining light was enough to show me something that made my blood freeze. Near what I thought was the back of the chamber. Something that might have been an eye opened, not a human eye, or even an animal eye, but something ancient and intelligent that focused on me with the kind of attention that made me feel like a bug under a microscope. I don't remember making the decision to get out of there. The next thing I knew, I was backing the excavator away from the chamber as fast as the machine would move, which isn't very fast, but felt like standing still when you're trying to get away from something that could probably swallow a city block. The remaining work light swept across the chamber opening as I backed up, and I caught a glimpse of movement that suggested the creature was repositioning itself, maybe getting ready to emerge from its hiding place. The excavator's engine started coughing and missing as I tried to turn around on the narrow mountain shelf we'd cut for the roadway. For a terrifying few seconds, I thought the machine was going to die completely and leave me stranded up there in the dark with whatever was living inside Widow's Peak. But the engine caught again, and I managed to get turned around and headed down the mountain access road. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, and then I sat in the truck stop parking lot until sunrise, trying to figure out what I was going to tell my supervisor. How do you explain that you abandoned $1 million piece of equipment because you found a monster living inside a mountain? How do you convince anyone that something the size of a building is hiding in plain sight, disguised as a geological formation? I ended up calling in sick for the rest of the week. When I finally went back to talk to the project supervisor, I told him I'd had some kind of equipment malfunction and thought it would be safer to shut down until the mechanics could check everything out. He wasn't happy about losing another night operator, but he didn't ask too many questions either. I think he was getting used to people finding reasons not to work the Widow's Peak section. The strangest part came about a month later, when I heard they'd redesigned the highway route. Instead of cutting through Widow's Peak, they were going to build around it, adding about 15 miles to the highway, but avoiding the mountain entirely. The official reason was geological instability and unexpected construction costs, but I knew better. Someone else had found what I'd found, or maybe the thing living in the mountain had made it clear that it didn't want to be disturbed anymore. I never went back to check on whether the excavator was still up there. Part of me hopes they managed to get it down safely, but another part of me wonders if it's still sitting on that mountain shelf, maybe being studied by something that's trying to understand how human machines work. I've thought about that eye I saw, the intelligence behind it, and I don't think whatever's living in Widow's Peak is malicious. I think it's just old, older than anything that should still be alive, and it wants to be left alone. These days, I stick to day shift work, and I won't take jobs that involve blasting into mountainsides. My kids ask me sometimes why I changed jobs, why I don't do the big construction projects anymore. I tell them it's because I wanted more regular hours, which is partly true. But the real reason is that I learned there are some places that weren't meant to be disturbed. Some things that have been sleeping peacefully for so long that waking them up would be the worst kind of mistake. I still drive past Widow's Peak sometimes when I'm heading to jobs in other counties. The mountain looks the same as it always did, just another Appalachian ridge covered in trees. But I know better now. I know that mountains aren't always just rock and dirt, and that some of the oldest things in these hills are still alive, still watching, still waiting for us to be smart enough to leave them alone. I'm 29 years old, and I clean houses for a living. 3 different jobs, actually, because that's what it takes to keep me and my mom afloat. She's been in a wheelchair since her stroke 2 years ago, and my daughter Carmen needs these expensive physical therapy sessions for her spine condition. So when I got a call about a cleaning job that paid triple my usual rate, I didn't ask too many questions. The woman on the phone said her family lived up in Copper Ridge, Kentucky, about an hour drive into the mountains from where I live in Hazard. She explained they had what she called a medical facility that needed monthly deep cleaning, and they were willing to pay $2,000 cash for discretion and thoroughness. $2,000. That's more than I usually make in 2 months combined from all my jobs. I remember thinking it was probably some kind of addiction recovery place, or maybe a home for elderly folks that wasn't quite up to state standards. People do what they have to do in these mountains when the government won't help. I've cleaned plenty of places that bent the rules to help their own people. As long as they weren't hurting anybody, I figured it wasn't my business. The drive up to Copper Ridge took me through some of the most beautiful and isolated country I'd ever seen. Winding mountain roads with drop-offs that made my stomach clench, old mining equipment rusting in creek beds, and forests so thick you couldn't see 10 feet between the trees. I'd lived in Kentucky my whole life, but this felt like a different world entirely. When I finally found the address, I had to double-check the GPS twice. The place looked like someone had taken 4 or 5 old mobile homes and connected them with covered walkways and additions. It sprawled across a cleared area like a compound, with solar panels on every roof and what looked like a pretty sophisticated electrical setup. There were old mining trucks parked around the property, and I could see a vegetable garden and some chickens penned up behind one of the trailers. Sarah Holloway met me at what I guessed was the main entrance. She was probably in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back tight and work clothes that had seen better days. What caught my attention immediately was that her left arm was missing from just below the elbow, replaced with what looked like a homemade prosthetic made from metal and wood. It was crude but functional, and she used it to shake my hand with surprising strength. "You must be Rosa," she said, her voice warm but tired. "I appreciate you coming all the way up here. I know it's a drive." She led me inside, explaining the layout as we walked. The connected trailers formed a kind of medical complex, with different areas for different purposes. There were examination rooms, a surgical suite, recovery areas, and living spaces for the family. Everything was clean but clearly improvised, like someone had watched a lot of medical shows and tried their best to recreate a hospital with whatever materials they could find. "Now, I need to be straight with you," Sarah said as we stopped in front of a door marked surgery. "What we do here isn't exactly traditional. We help people who can't get help anywhere else. Mining folks mostly, people who got hurt on the job and got abandoned by the system. The insurance companies and the mining corporations, they find ways to deny coverage. Say it was the worker's fault, safety violations, pre-existing conditions, you know how it is." I knew exactly how it was. My own father had died in a mine collapse when I was 12, and the company had fought my mother's claim for 3 years before finally paying out a settlement that barely covered his funeral. "What I need from you," Sarah continued, "is to clean thoroughly and not ask questions about what you see. Medical equipment, supplies, whatever. We're helping people, but we're not exactly licensed to do it. You understand?" I understood, and honestly, $2,000 was enough to keep me from asking too many questions anyway. The first few rooms I cleaned were pretty standard. Medical supplies, examination tables, the kind of equipment you might see in any doctor's office. It was when I got to the surgical suite that things started feeling different. The tools were a mix of professional medical equipment and what looked like handmade instruments. There were prosthetics hanging on the walls, arms, legs, hands, but they weren't the smooth, flesh-colored ones you see in hospitals. These were clearly crafted from wood and metal, more like works of art than medical devices. I was scrubbing bloodstains from an operating table when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a man in a wheelchair, or what I thought was a wheelchair at first glance. Looking closer, I realized his legs had been amputated and replaced with carved wooden prosthetics that were attached to a mobile base he could operate with his hands. "You're the new cleaner," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Jake Holloway. This is my place." Jake looked like he was in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face you get from years of hard work outdoors. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, but there was a sadness in them that reminded me of my mother after her stroke. The look of someone who'd had to rebuild their entire life around a disability they never expected. "Caven took my legs 5 years ago," he said, noticing me looking at his prosthetics. "Company said it was my fault for not following safety protocols. Funny thing is, there weren't any safety protocols. They just made that up after the accident to avoid paying claims." He showed me around the rest of the compound, introducing me to his family. His son Tommy was maybe 25, missing 3 fingers on his left hand from another mining accident. His daughter Beth, who couldn't have been older than 20, had a metal plate covering half her skull that looked like it had been crafted in someone's workshop rather than a medical facility. "We learned to fix ourselves when nobody else would," Jake explained, as we walked through a room filled with people in various stages of recovery. Started with basic first aid, moved up to setting bones, then surgical procedures. You'd be surprised what you can accomplish when the alternative is dying. The people in the recovery room weren't just family members. There were maybe a dozen folks, all with various injuries and disabilities, all fitted with handmade prosthetics or medical devices that looked functional despite their rough appearance. A woman my age was learning to walk with wooden leg braces. An older man was practicing writing with a prosthetic hand that had multiple tool attachments. "Mining company doctors gave up on all of them," Beth said, joining our conversation. She spoke with a slight slur, probably related to her head injury. Said their injuries were too severe, too expensive to treat. so they came to us. I spent the rest of that first day cleaning and trying to process what I was seeing. These people had essentially created their own medical system, complete with surgery, recovery, and rehabilitation. The success rate seemed surprisingly high. People were walking, working, living productive lives with prosthetics and medical devices that looked crude but functioned better than anything I'd seen in traditional medical facilities. But it was also clearly dangerous. I found a basement room that Sarah quietly told me not to clean. Just change the sheets and mop the floor. It was obviously a morgue. Simple wooden coffins stacked against the wall, and the smell of formaldehyde barely covering something else I didn't want to think about too hard. We only take cases everyone else has given up on, Sarah explained when she saw my expression. People who are going to die anyway, if someone doesn't try to help. Yes, we lose some, but we save more than any hospital in this region would even attempt to treat. I drove home that day with my head spinning and $2,000 cash in my purse. The money would cover Carmen's therapy for 3 months, and my mother's medications with some left over for groceries. But I couldn't shake the image of that basement morgue or the thought that these people were performing major surgery without licenses, without oversight, without any of the safeguards that medical facilities are supposed to have. Over the next few months, I went back every 4 weeks to clean. I got to know the family better, learned more about their operation. Jake had been an engineer before his accident, which explained the sophisticated mechanical prosthetics. Sarah had worked as a veterinarian before losing her arm, so she understood surgical procedures. Tommy and Beth had both taken online courses in anatomy and medical techniques. They showed me their success stories. People who'd regained full mobility, children who'd been given up for dead who were now running around the compound, miners who'd returned to work with prosthetics that were actually superior to their original limbs in some ways. Jake's wooden legs, for example, didn't get tired or hurt. Tommy's prosthetic hand could grip things with mechanical precision that his flesh and blood fingers never could have managed. But I also saw the failures. Not just the morgue, but people who'd survived surgery but weren't quite right afterward. A man whose prosthetic leg had gotten infected and never healed properly. A woman whose homemade pacemaker had malfunctioned, leaving her weak and confused. Medicine is trial and error, Jake told me one day while I was cleaning his workshop. The only difference between us and the hospitals is that we're honest about it, and we don't charge people their life savings to roll the dice. It was during my 4th visit that Sarah pulled me aside with a proposition that changed everything. "We know about Carmen," she said. "We know about her spinal condition, and we know her insurance got denied for the surgery." My blood went cold. I'd never mentioned my daughter to them, never talked about her medical problems. We make it our business to know about the people we work with, Sarah said gently. "Rosa, we can help her. We've done spinal fusion surgery on 3 children in the past 2 years, all successful, all walking normally now." I wanted to say no immediately. But Carmen's condition was getting worse. The curvature in her spine was progressing faster than the doctors had predicted, and without surgery, she'd be in a wheelchair within the year. The operation cost $60,000, and our insurance had denied the claim 3 times. "I need to think about it," I said. "Of course, but don't think too long. Time is working against her." I drove home that day feeling like I was drowning. On one hand, these people were clearly skilled and had genuinely helped dozens of patients who had nowhere else to turn. On the other hand, they were operating outside the law, without proper medical licenses or oversight. If something went wrong during Carmen's surgery, I'd have no legal recourse. Worse, I'd have no one to blame but myself. I spent weeks researching everything I could about the Holloway family's medical practice. I found online forums where their former patients talked about their experiences. Most were positive, people grateful to be alive and functional when traditional medicine had given up on them. But there were also horror stories. Botched surgeries, infections, one woman whose prosthetic arm had fallen apart after 6 months, leaving her worse off than before. The decision was taken out of my hands when Carmen collapsed at school. The school nurse said her breathing was becoming labored, and the curvature in her spine was pressing against her lungs. The emergency room doctor told me bluntly that without immediate surgery, Carmen would likely die within months. But her insurance was denied. I said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do without payment up front. The surgery costs $60,000. I know. I called Sarah from the hospital parking lot. Carmen arrived at the Holloway compound on a Thursday morning in October. The leaves were changing, and the mountain air had that crisp quality that usually made me feel hopeful about the future. Today, it just made me feel like I was driving my daughter to her death. The surgical suite had been prepared with the kind of precision I'd seen in medical documentaries. Every surface was sterilized, every instrument laid out with surgical precision. Jake would be performing the operation with Sarah assisting, while Beth monitored Carmen's vital signs. "We've done this exact procedure 17 times, Jake assured me as they prepared Carmen for surgery. 15 successes, 1 partial success, 1 failure. Better odds than you'd get at most hospitals, especially for a case this severe. The surgery took 6 hours. I spent the time cleaning the rest of the compound, partly because Sarah had asked me to, and partly because I needed something to do with my hands. I scrubbed floors until my knuckles bled, organized medical supplies until every bandage was perfectly aligned, and tried not to think about the fact that my daughter was having her spine reconstructed with homemade surgical instruments. It was during the 5th hour that we heard sirens in the distance. "Police," Tommy said, looking out the window. Someone called them. Sarah came out of the surgical suite, still in her scrubs. "We need to finish the surgery first. Rosa, we need you to help us move equipment. If they find evidence of unlicensed medical practice, they'll shut us down permanently." The next hour was a blur of organized chaos. While Jake continued operating on Carmen, the rest of us worked to hide or relocate anything that looked too medical. Surgical instruments went into hidden compartments, medical records were shredded or moved to a secure location, and the more obvious prosthetics were covered or removed entirely. The police raid happened just as Jake was closing Carmen's incision. I heard boots on the front steps, voices shouting about search warrants, while my daughter lay unconscious on an operating table with her spine held together by metal rods that had been crafted in the same workshop where Jake built his prosthetic legs. "Surgery's complete," Jake announced quietly. "She's stable. Rosa, we need you to get her out of here." Sarah and Beth helped me move Carmen to a recovery room that looked like a normal bedroom. To anyone who didn't look too carefully, she'd just be a sick child resting in bed. The surgical incision was covered by pajamas, and the monitors had been replaced with a simple thermometer and blood pressure cuff. The police searched for 3 hours but found nothing that definitively proved illegal medical practice. The compound was set up to look like an extended family taking care of disabled relatives, which was technically true. The hidden surgical equipment stayed hidden, and the family story held up under questioning. But the stress of the raid had taken its toll. Jake was exhausted from performing surgery under pressure, Sarah was shaking from adrenaline, and Carmen was still unconscious from anesthesia and couldn't be moved safely for at least 12 hours. We spent the night in the compound while Carmen recovered. By morning, it was clear that the surgery had been successful. Carmen could move her legs normally, her breathing was clear, and the curvature in her spine had been completely corrected. The metal rods were invisible under her skin, and the surgical incision was healing cleanly. But it was also clear that the family couldn't stay at Copper Ridge much longer. The police raid had been too close, and someone in the community had obviously reported them. "We'll relocate," Jake told me as I prepared to take Carmen home. "Find somewhere else to set up. There are always people who need help." Sarah handed me a bag of medical supplies, antibiotics, pain medication, and detailed instructions for Carmen's recovery care. "She'll need checkups, but she should heal completely. The rods will grow with her spine. She'll be able to live a normal life." I drove Carmen home that morning, knowing I'd participated in something that was simultaneously one of the most dangerous and most compassionate things I'd ever witnessed. My daughter would walk normally, run, play, have a future that didn't include a wheelchair or breathing problems. But the cost had been trusting her life to people who operated outside every safety regulation and legal framework designed to protect patients. The Holloway family scattered into the mountains within a week of the police raid. I never saw them again at Copper Ridge, but I started hearing stories about a mobile medical unit that showed up wherever there had been mining accidents or industrial injuries. People who'd been abandoned by insurance companies and traditional medicine would find help from a group of medical practitioners who worked out of converted trailers and charged nothing but gratitude. I still send medical supplies when I can afford them, usually through intermediaries who know how to contact the family. I never ask where they are or what they're doing, but the supplies always disappear, and I occasionally hear success stories that sound familiar. Carmen is 15 now and completely healthy. Her spine is straight, her breathing is clear, and she plays soccer for her high school team. The metal rods in her back are undetectable unless you know to look for the tiny scars from Jake's precise surgical work. I never reported the Holloway family to any medical boards or law enforcement agencies. What they were doing was illegal, dangerous, and completely outside any reasonable standard of medical care. But they saved my daughter's life when nobody else would even try. And they've saved dozens of other people who had nowhere else to turn. Looking back now, I understand that what I witnessed wasn't really about medicine at all. It was about what happens when people get abandoned by the systems that are supposed to help them, and they decide to help each other instead. The Holloway family wasn't playing doctor for fun or profit. They were doing what they had to do to survive, and they were sharing that knowledge with other people who'd been thrown away by society. I still clean houses for a living, but I only work 2 jobs now instead of 3. Carmen's medical expenses are minimal, just regular checkups that show everything is healing perfectly. My mother's condition has stabilized, and we're managing fine financially. But I think about the Holloway family every time I hear about someone getting denied medical coverage. Every time the news reports on mining accidents or industrial injuries where workers get blamed for their own suffering. I think about Jake's wooden legs and Sarah's prosthetic arm and all those people in their recovery room who were learning to live again because someone cared enough to help them when everyone else had given up. I don't talk about this much. Most people wouldn't understand why I trusted my daughter's life to unlicensed medical practitioners operating out of connected mobile homes. But when your child is dying and no one else will help, you don't really have the luxury of judging the people who are willing to try. To this day, I keep medical supplies in my cleaning kit, antibiotics, bandages, pain medication. Just in case I run into someone who needs help and can't afford to get it the legal way. Because I learned from the Holloway family that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is break the rules that keep people from getting the help they need to survive. I was 35 when I found out my father had been lying to me my entire life. My name's Marcus Thompson, and I work as an insurance adjuster, or worked, I should say. These days, I do freelance consulting. Nothing that keeps me tied to one place too long. Back then, though, I was struggling. Recent divorce, barely seeing my teenage son Jake, and my supervisor had made it pretty clear that if I didn't close some major cases soon, I'd be looking for a new career. That's how I ended up driving through Virginia's back roads in October of 2019, chasing down what seemed like the break I desperately needed. My father had died 6 months earlier. We weren't close, hadn't been since he walked out when I was 10. The man never talked about family, claimed we didn't have any relatives worth knowing, said his people were all dead or worthless. So you can imagine my surprise when a law firm in Richmond called to tell me he'd left behind a property in something called Dead Man's Hollow, Virginia, worth approximately $2 million. The whole thing stank of insurance fraud from the start. A man who'd worked construction his whole life, who'd never mentioned owning so much as a storage unit, suddenly has a multi-million-dollar estate. My company assigned me to investigate before they'd release any death benefits. I figured it'd be a quick trip. Drive down, prove the paperwork was bogus, close the case, keep my job. Simple. I should have known better. Nothing involving my father was ever simple. The drive to Dead Man's Hollow took me deep into Virginia's mountains, past towns that looked like they'd been forgotten by time. My GPS kept losing signal, and I had to rely on increasingly vague directions from gas station attendants who seemed surprised anyone was headed that direction. "You got family up there?" one old man asked when I stopped for coffee. When I said maybe, he just nodded slow and said, "Well, I reckon they'll be expecting you then." The property sat at the end of a dirt road that wound through thick forest for about 5 miles. I'd studied the satellite images beforehand. Looked like farmland, maybe some timber rights, definitely remote. What I found when I finally arrived made no sense at all. It was a working farm, not abandoned, not overgrown, actively maintained. Tobacco fields stretched out behind a large farmhouse that looked like it belonged in a history book. There were outbuildings, livestock, even laundry hanging on lines. Smoke rose from the chimney. My first thought was that squatters had moved in, but as I got closer, I noticed something strange about everything I was seeing. The buildings looked old, but not run-down old, maintained old, authentic old. The fence posts were hand-split rails. The plow sitting in the field was drawn by actual horses. And the people I could see working the land, they were dressed like something out of a Civil War reenactment. I parked my truck near the house and climbed out, immediately feeling like I'd stepped into a museum exhibit. A woman in a long dress and apron was hanging clothes on the line, using wooden pins. A man in suspenders and a wide-brimmed hat was chopping wood with an axe. Children in simple clothes played in the yard with wooden toys. All of it looked perfectly normal, except for the fact that it was 2019, and these people were living like it was 1860. The woman noticed me first. She dropped the shirt she'd been hanging and called out, "Ezra, he's here, the boys come home." Before I could introduce myself, an older man emerged from the house. Tall, bearded, wearing clothes that belonged in a daguerreotype. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to recognize me, though I'd never seen him before in my life. "Marcus Thompson," he said, not a question. "Son of Daniel. You've got your grandfather's jaw, boy. I'm Ezra Thompson. Your great-great-grandfather. Welcome home." I stood there with my mouth probably hanging open, insurance paperwork in my hand, feeling suddenly ridiculous. "I'm sorry, there's been some mistake. My father never mentioned any family, any property." "Course he didn't," Ezra said, walking closer. "Daniel ran off in '68, said he wanted no part of the Thompson way, broke his mother's heart. But blood calls to blood, boy. You're here now, and that's what matters." The other people had stopped their work and were gathering around. Men, women, children, maybe 20 people in total, all dressed like they'd stepped out of the 1800s. They looked at me with expressions of satisfaction, like they'd been waiting for me specifically. "I don't understand," I said. "This property. The records show continuous occupation by Thompson since 1847. But that's impossible. My father said we had no family land." "Your father was wrong about a lot of things," said a woman who'd introduced herself as my great-great-aunt Ruth. "Come inside, Marcus. There's much you need to know." The interior of the house matched the exterior perfectly. Oil lamps instead of electric lights, a wood-burning stove, furniture that looked handmade from local timber. But it wasn't shabby or primitive. Everything was well-maintained, comfortable, purposeful. These people weren't playing dress-up. This was how they lived. Ezra showed me to a table where he'd laid out documents, handwritten genealogy charts, land deeds, family records going back generations. My name was on those charts. So was Jake's. "We've been keeping track," Ezra explained. "Even after Daniel left, we knew where he went, what he did, who he married. We knew when you were born, when you married Sarah, when Jake came along. We know about your divorce, your job troubles, your problems with the boy." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. "How could you possibly know about my divorce?" Ruth smiled sadly. "We have our ways, child. The Thompson family looks after its own, even when they don't know they're being looked after." That's when they started showing me photographs. Digital photographs, printed on modern paper. Pictures of me leaving my apartment in Richmond. Pictures of Jake at his school. Pictures of my ex-wife Sarah at her new boyfriend's house. Dozens of them, dating back years. "You've been watching us," I said, my voice barely steady. "You've been stalking my family." "Protecting," Ezra corrected, "and guiding. Sometimes a man needs to lose everything modern before he can appreciate what's eternal. Your father thought the outside world would make him happy. How did that work out for him?" I thought about my father's life, the drinking, the job hopping, the way he'd run from responsibility, the way he'd never been able to settle anywhere, never seemed comfortable in his own skin. I thought about my own recent failures, my failed marriage, how I barely knew my own son anymore. "The Thompson way isn't easy," Ruth continued, "but it's certain, it's stable. Look around you, Marcus. This community has thrived for over 150 years. No unemployment, no crime, no broken families. Children respect their elders. People know their place and their purpose. But you're living in the past," I protested. "There's no electricity, no phones, no modern medicine, and no divorce," Ezra said quietly. "No drugs, no violence, no children growing up without fathers. Tell me, Marcus, How has the modern world served you? I couldn't answer that. Sarah had left me because I worked too much, cared more about closing cases than closing the distance between us. Jake barely spoke to me anymore, saw me as just another adult who'd let him down. I was on the verge of losing my job, my apartment, probably any chance of shared custody. The inheritance comes with conditions, Ezra continued, pulling out a thick legal document. To claim your rightful place as head of the Thompson family, you must live here for 5 years minimum. Learn our ways. Embrace the lifestyle that sustained us for generations. And if I don't, then the land goes to the next in line. He smiled. Your son, Jake. As if summoned by his name, I heard a car door slam outside. My heart lurched as I recognized the engine sound, Sarah's Honda. Through the window, I watched my son Jake climb out of the passenger seat, looking around with wonder at the historical scene before him. How is he here? I demanded, standing so fast I knocked over my chair. We invited him, Ruth said calmly, called his mother, told her you'd requested a family visit to discuss your inheritance. She was happy to drive him down, especially when we mentioned the property's value. Jake was 17. At that age where he questioned everything about modern life, everything about authority. As he walked into the house and saw the oil lamps, the handmade furniture, the people in period clothing, his eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. Dad, this is incredible. Is this really our family? Jake, we need to leave, I said, right now. But he was already talking to some of the younger people, fascinated by their clothes, their tools, their way of life. I watched my son, who'd never shown interest in anything that didn't involve a screen, asking eager questions about farming, about crafts, about what it meant to live authentically. This is what's been missing, he said to me, his face more animated than I'd seen since he was a child. This is real, Dad. This is meaningful, not like the fake plastic world where everyone's miserable. Sarah had driven away already, satisfied that Jake was with family. She had no idea what she'd left him with. Over the next 2 days, I watched my son transform. The community put him to work in the fields, teaching him to harvest tobacco, to care for livestock, to use hand tools. He took to it naturally, like he'd been born for this life. At night, the family gathered around the fire while Ezra told stories about Thompson ancestors, about the importance of tradition, about the corruption of modern values. Jake absorbed every word. We're not prisoners here, Ezra told me on the second evening. You're free to leave whenever you want, but Jake is 17, old enough to make his own choices about where he wants to live, what kind of life he wants to build. You can't just keep him here, I said. We're not keeping him anywhere. We're offering him something you never could: purpose, community, connection to something larger than himself. Look at him, Marcus. When's the last time you saw the boy that happy? It was true. Jake was laughing with his cousins. I guess they were cousins, as they worked. He'd stopped checking his phone, stopped complaining about being bored. For the first time in years, my son looked content. But I'd been doing some investigating of my own while they were focused on Jake's education. I'd found my father's room, preserved exactly as he'd left it in 1968. Hidden under the floorboards, I'd discovered his journal. The entries painted a picture of a community that wasn't quite as voluntary as they claimed. Daniel had tried to leave multiple times. Each attempt was thwarted by family members who convinced him to stay. They destroyed his identification papers, isolated him from the outside world, made him financially dependent on the community. The final entry, dated just days before his disappearance, was chilling. They'll never let me go willingly. Tomorrow I'm going hunting with Ezra and Samuel. If I don't make it back, if something happens to my gun while we're out there, at least maybe someone will think I'm dead and stop looking for me. It's the only way. My father had faked his own death to escape this place, and now they had my son. That night, I made my decision. I found Jake in the barn, helping with the evening milking. Jake, we need to talk. Dad, this place is amazing. These people, they have something figured out that the rest of the world has lost. I want to stay. You can't stay. This isn't what it seems. I tried to explain what I'd found, but Jake was 17 and convinced he'd discovered something profound. He saw my objections as jealousy, as fear of him finding happiness that I'd never been able to provide. You just don't get it, he said. You're part of the problem. You're part of what's wrong with the world. The next morning, I told Ezra I needed to go back to Richmond to settle some affairs before I could commit to the 5-year residency requirement. I asked to take Jake with me. Of course, Ezra said, but Jake's decided he'd like to stay and continue learning our ways. Haven't you, boy? Jake nodded eagerly. I want to be here, Dad. For the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere. I realized then that I wasn't going to convince Jake to leave voluntarily, and I was starting to understand that the family wasn't going to let either of us leave without a fight. That afternoon, I suggested Jake and I go hunting together. Ezra seemed pleased by this, a Thompson tradition, he called it. He provided us with period-appropriate rifles, the same kind my father had carried on his last hunting trip here 50 years ago. We walked deep into the woods, just the two of us. Jake was excited, talking about how he wanted to learn all the old skills, how he'd never felt so connected to his heritage. As we walked, I kept thinking about my father's journal, about how he'd used a hunting trip to stage his escape. Jake, I said when we were far enough from the house, what if I told you this family has been manipulating our lives for years? What if I told you they were responsible for your mother and me getting divorced? Dad, that's crazy talk. Is it? I pulled out my phone and showed him some of the photos Ezra had shown me. How do you think they got these? They've been stalking us, Jake. They engineered my failures to make me desperate enough to come here. For the first time since we'd arrived, Jake looked uncertain. I told him about the journal, about his grandfather's escape, about how this community had maintained their lifestyle not through choice, but through control. Jake listened, and I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. Even if that's true, he said finally, maybe they're right. Maybe you needed to lose everything modern to find what really matters. What really matters is choice, Jake. The choice to live how you want, to make your own mistakes, to find your own path. They're trying to take that away from you. A gunshot echoed through the forest, close enough to make us both jump. Then another. Hunting party, Jake said, but his voice was nervous now. No, I said, listening to the pattern of shots. They're signaling. They know we're talking. That's when we heard the voices calling through the trees. Marcus, Jake, where are you boys? But there was something wrong with the voices. They were too loud, too coordinated. This wasn't a search party. It was a hunt. They're not going to let us leave, I told Jake, either of us. Finally, my son understood. The spell of the place broke, and he saw it for what it really was, a beautiful prison. We started moving through the forest, trying to make our way back toward where I'd left my truck. But the voices seemed to be coming from every direction now, and I realized they knew these woods better than we ever could. They'd been hunting here for 150 years. This way, Jake whispered, pointing toward a ridge. I saw an old logging road when we were walking in. We climbed through thick underbrush, trying to stay quiet. Behind us, we could hear them calling. Ezra's voice, Ruth's voice, others I didn't recognize. They weren't panicked or angry. They sounded patient, like they were herding livestock back to the barn. At the top of the ridge, we found the old road Jake had spotted. It was overgrown but still passable. We followed it for maybe a mile before we heard the sound of an engine behind us. They have vehicles, Jake said. Period-appropriate ones, probably, I replied. Horse-drawn wagon, maybe. But when the sound got closer, I realized I was wrong. It was a modern ATV, moving fast through the forest. We ran. The logging road connected to a state highway, about 3 miles from the Thompson property. We made it there, just as my phone finally got a signal again. I called 911, reported that my son and I were being pursued by armed individuals, gave them our location. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived. By then, there was no sign of our pursuers. You sure about what you saw? The deputy asked after taking our statement. I've lived in this county my whole life, never heard of any Thompson family up in Deadman's Hollow. When we drove back to get my truck the next day, accompanied by 2 deputies, we found nothing. The farmhouse was there, but it was clearly abandoned, had been for decades. No tobacco fields, no livestock, no people in period clothing. Just an empty, crumbling house slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Place has been vacant since the 1972nd, the deputy said. Used to be a historical preserve or something, but funding got cut. The only evidence of our time there was my truck, right where I'd left it, and a manila envelope on the driver's seat. Inside was the deed to the property, legally transferring ownership to me, and a note written in careful script. Every Thompson finds his way home eventually. The land will wait. I sold the property 6 months later to the State Historical Society, with the stipulation that it be maintained as a public historical site. I never found out who I actually sold it to. The lawyer said the previous ownership records were unusually complex, going back several generations. Jake and I moved to Colorado after that. My son never fully embraced modern life again, but in a good way. He learned woodworking, grows his own vegetables, builds furniture with hand tools. He says the experience taught him to appreciate genuine craftsmanship and authentic living, just not the kind that comes with invisible prison bars. I still get Christmas cards sometimes, no return address, postmarked from small Virginia towns. They're signed, the Thompson family, and they always include a recent photo of my house, or Jake at his job, or my ex-wife Sarah with her new family. We're still being watched, but from a distance now. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd accepted Ezra's offer and embraced the Thompson way. Would I have been happier? Would Jake? Would we have found the peace and purpose they promised? I'll never know, but I do know this: choice matters. The freedom to make your own mistakes, to find your own path, to succeed or fail on your own terms. That's worth more than all the peace and certainty in the world, even if it means spending the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. I'm 29 years old and work as a freelance photographer, mostly doing weddings and family portraits around Louisville. It's not the most exciting work, but it pays the bills and lets me spend time with my 8-year-old daughter Sophia when she's not at school. Her dad's not in the picture anymore, so it's just been me and her for the past 3 years. I'd been scraping by okay until my camera equipment got stolen from my car last winter, and between replacing everything and keeping up with rent, I was pretty much drowning financially. That's when I got this email about a cave photography job. The message was short and professional. Someone wanted high-quality photographs of an unexplored cave system in the Mammoth Cave region for what they called geological documentation purposes. They were offering $5,000 up front, with another $5,000 when I delivered the photos. For someone who was behind on rent and had been eating ramen for 2 weeks straight, it felt like a miracle. The client went by the name Dr. Harrison and said he represented a private research group studying Kentucky's underground limestone formations. He sent me hand-drawn maps of the cave system, detailed sketches that looked like they'd been made by someone who'd actually been down there. The entrance was marked on private property, about 40 minutes south of Mammoth Cave National Park. When I asked why they couldn't use the park's official photographers, Dr. Harrison explained that this particular cave wasn't part of the national park system and had never been officially surveyed. They wanted documentation before bringing in any larger research teams. I should have asked more questions. Looking back now, the whole thing had red flags all over it. The vague credentials, the insistence on secrecy, the fact that they were paying so much for what should have been a simple documentation job. But Sophia needed new school clothes, and I needed to catch up on bills. Sometimes desperation makes you ignore your better judgment. The cave was exactly where the coordinates said it would be, tucked into a hillside on what looked like abandoned farmland. No signs, no fencing, just an old gravel road that wound through thick woods before ending at a clearing. The entrance itself was the first thing that struck me as odd. Most natural cave openings in Kentucky are irregular, cracks in the rock face or gaps between boulders. This one was perfectly round, about 6 feet in diameter, with walls so smooth they looked like they'd been carved with tools. I'd brought all my professional equipment, multiple cameras, portable lighting rigs, extra batteries, safety gear. Cave photography was something I'd done before, mostly for tourism brochures, so I knew the basics. The air temperature at the entrance felt normal for September, maybe 65 degrees, and my headlamp beam showed a tunnel descending at a gentle slope into the darkness. The maps Dr. Harrison had provided showed the main tunnel dropping about 200 feet over the course of half a mile before opening into a series of chambers. According to his notes, the geological formations I was supposed to document were in the deepest accessible areas. He'd marked specific spots where he wanted detailed photography, complete with camera angles and lighting suggestions. For someone who claimed this was an unexplored system, he seemed to know it pretty well. I started taking photos as soon as I entered, documenting the entrance and the initial tunnel. The walls were limestone, like you'd expect in this part of Kentucky, but the surface was unusually smooth. Most caves have rough, irregular walls carved by water over thousands of years. These looked almost polished. My camera flash revealed what looked like minerals in the rock, phosphorescent veins that seemed to glow faintly, even when my lights weren't directly on them. About 20 minutes in, I noticed the temperature starting to change. Instead of getting cooler as I went deeper, like caves normally do, it was getting warmer. Not dramatically, but enough that I was starting to sweat inside my jacket. The air was also getting thicker, more humid, which didn't make sense for an underground environment in September. I checked my notes again. Dr. Harrison had mentioned unusual atmospheric conditions but hadn't explained what that meant. The tunnel continued to descend, following the path marked on the maps perfectly. I was starting to wonder how whoever drew these had gotten such accurate measurements without modern surveying equipment. Every turn, every branch in the tunnel, every chamber entrance was exactly where the drawings showed it should be. The level of detail was incredible, down to small alcoves and rock formations. That's when I started noticing the carvings. At first, I thought they were just natural erosion patterns in the limestone. But when I got my camera lights positioned correctly, I could see they were definitely intentional. Spirals carved into the cave walls, some shallow, others deep enough to put my fingers into. They weren't random scratches either. The spirals followed specific patterns, connecting to each other in ways that looked almost like writing or symbols. When I tried to follow one with my eyes, it seemed to move in my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly at it, it was just carved stone. I took dozens of photos of the carvings. Through my camera lens, I could see details that weren't visible to my naked eye. Smaller symbols within the spirals, what looked like crude drawings of human figures, and shapes that might have been animals or something else entirely. Some of the carvings looked ancient, worn smooth by time and moisture. Others looked much newer, sharp-edged and recent. The maps showed a large central chamber about half a mile ahead, and that's where Dr. Harrison wanted most of the detailed photography. I was making good time, documenting everything as I went. The tunnel had opened up enough that I could stand upright comfortably, and the floor was surprisingly level and clear of debris. Too clear, really. Most caves accumulate rocks, mud, organic matter washed in from outside. This one was clean, like someone had been maintaining it. The acoustics were wrong too. When I called out to test the echo, my voice just seemed to get absorbed by the walls. But smaller sounds, the scrape of my boot, the click of my camera, echoed for much longer than they should have. I could hear my own breathing bouncing back at me from somewhere far ahead, but when I shouted, the sound just died. I was about 40 minutes into the cave when I reached the first major chamber. It was massive. My headlamp beam couldn't find the ceiling, and when I set up my portable floodlights, I could see the space was easily 50 feet wide and probably twice that tall. The walls were covered with more carvings, but these were different. Instead of abstract spirals, these showed clear images. Human figures gathered around larger shapes that might have been animals or something else entirely. The figures appeared to be kneeling, arms raised, in what looked like worship or supplication. The larger shapes in the drawings were harder to interpret. They weren't quite human, too tall, wrong proportions, with what might have been extra limbs or appendages. Some of the images showed these figures emerging from holes in the ground. Others showed them hovering above groups of humans. In a few of the drawings, the human figures appeared to be offering objects or even other humans to the larger entities. I spent nearly an hour in that first chamber, photographing everything from multiple angles. My camera was picking up details in the carvings that I couldn't see with my lights alone. When I reviewed the images on my camera's LCD screen, I could see that some of the drawings included what looked like modern elements. Rectangular shapes that could have been buildings or vehicles, figures wearing what might have been contemporary clothing. But that was impossible. These carvings looked like they'd been here for centuries. The central chamber Dr. Harrison had marked on his maps was still ahead, deeper into the cave system. According to the drawings, it contained what he called the primary formation, some kind of geological feature that was the main reason for this documentation project. I packed up my lights and continued following the tunnel. This is where things started to feel genuinely wrong. The walls around me were pulsing. Not dramatically, not like something out of a horror movie, just a subtle rhythm, like breathing. The movement was so slight that at first I thought it was my imagination, maybe fatigue from carrying heavy camera equipment. But when I stopped and put my hand against the limestone, I could feel it. A gentle expansion and contraction, steady as a heartbeat. The airflow was changing direction too. I'd been feeling a slight breeze coming from deeper in the cave, which made sense if there were other openings somewhere ahead. But every few minutes, the air would reverse, flowing back toward the entrance, then switch again. The temperature kept climbing. I'd taken off my jacket 20 minutes ago, and now I was sweating through my shirt. I could hear something ahead of me. Not voices, not exactly, but a low rumbling that seemed to come from the cave walls themselves. It had rhythm to it, almost like very deep, slow music. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the central chamber, still maybe 10 minutes ahead, according to the map. That's when I started to wonder who Dr. Harrison really was, and how he'd gotten such detailed maps of a cave system that was supposedly unexplored. The tunnel ahead of me split into 3 branches. The map showed I should take the middle passage to reach the central chamber. The left and right tunnels weren't marked with any detail, just shown disappearing into the rock with the notation, unmapped, do not explore. I stuck to the plan and headed down the center passage. The phosphorescent minerals in the walls were getting brighter as I went deeper. What had been faint veins near the entrance were now distinct lines of soft blue-green light running through the limestone. In some places, the glow was bright enough that I could navigate without my headlamp. The effect was beautiful, but deeply unsettling. I'd never seen anything like it in any other cave. The tunnel opened into the central chamber without warning. One moment, I was in a narrow passage. The next, I was standing at the edge of a vast underground space. My lights couldn't reach the far walls, but the phosphorescent glow in the rock was bright enough to show me the general shape of the room. And in the center, exactly where Dr. Harrison's map had indicated, was an underground lake. The water was warm. I could tell because steam was rising from the surface, visible in my lights and carrying the smell of minerals and something organic I couldn't identify. The lake glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the walls, maybe brighter. Looking down into it was like staring into a pool of liquid stars. I set up my photography equipment at the edge of the water and started documenting the chamber. Through my camera lens, I could see that this wasn't a natural formation. The chamber was too perfectly circular, too symmetrical. The lake was exactly in the center, and the walls showed clear tool marks, spiral patterns, carved into the stone in the same style as the tunnels, but much more elaborate. That's when I saw the other tunnel openings. Arrayed around the far side of the lake like spokes on a wheel were at least 6 other passages leading off into the darkness. They weren't on Dr. Harrison's map. According to his drawings, this chamber was the end of the cave system, the deepest accessible point. But clearly, the cave continued much further than he'd indicated. I was setting up for a long exposure shot of the lake when something large moved under the water. Not fish. Fish don't grow that big, and the shape was wrong anyway. Something, at least the size of a person, maybe bigger, gliding just below the surface of the phosphorescent lake. The water was clear enough that I should have been able to see details, but whatever was down there seemed to bend light around itself, creating distortions that made it impossible to focus on. I took the shot anyway. The camera flash illuminated the entire chamber for a split second, and in that brief moment of harsh light, I saw them. Pale shapes standing in the mouths of the tunnels across the lake. Human-sized but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with movements that didn't look quite natural. They were watching me. I couldn't see faces or features in the flash, just the suggestion of forms that might have been people, if people could stand perfectly motionless and bend at angles that human joints don't allow. When my vision recovered from the flash, they were gone. The tunnel mouths were empty, dark openings in the phosphorescent rock. But I could feel them still watching from the darkness, and I could hear something new. A sound like whispered conversation, but too low and too fast for me to make out any words. I looked at the image on my camera's LCD screen. The photo showed the lake, the chamber walls, the tunnel openings. And in those tunnels, barely visible unless you knew to look for them, pale shapes that definitely weren't rock formations. The cave walls around me were pulsing faster now, the breathing rhythm more pronounced. The temperature had climbed to at least 80 degrees, maybe more. I was soaked with sweat and having trouble breathing in the thick, humid air. The rumbling sound I'd been hearing was louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from ahead of me anymore. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet. I was standing inside something alive. The knowledge hit me all at once, like a physical blow. This wasn't a cave system. The smooth walls, the perfect circular chambers, the increasing temperature as you went deeper. I was inside some massive organism, following passages that weren't tunnels but something more like arteries or digestive tracts. The phosphorescent minerals weren't minerals at all. They were some kind of biological luminescence. And the entities I'd glimpsed across the lake weren't intruders like me. They lived here. They were part of whatever this thing was. I started backing away from the lake, but I could hear movement in the tunnels behind me. Not the shuffle of footsteps, but something like fabric sliding across stone, or skin moving against smooth rock. They were coming up through the passage I'd used to enter the chamber. The water in the lake began to glow brighter, and more shapes moved beneath the surface. Larger ones this time, forms that suggested tentacles or appendages reaching up toward the surface. The whispered sounds were getting louder, forming patterns that almost sounded like language, but in no language I'd ever heard. I grabbed my camera equipment and ran for one of the unmarked tunnels. It was a mistake. The passage I chose sloped downward even more steeply than the main tunnel, leading deeper into whatever this thing was. The walls were wet now, not with water but with something thicker, more viscous. The phosphorescent glow was so bright I didn't need my headlamp anymore, and the rhythmic pulsing of the walls was strong enough to throw off my balance. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not footsteps, but the sound of many bodies moving through the passages with fluid, inhuman grace. They were communicating with those subsonic whispers, coordinating their movement, herding me deeper into their domain. The passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the lake room, but filled with something that made my blood freeze. The walls were covered with photographs. Recent photographs. Printed on modern paper, pictures of people entering the cave system, carrying cameras and equipment just like mine. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, dating back years based on the clothing and photo quality. I was looking at a gallery of everyone who had accepted Dr. Harrison's job offer. The photos showed the same progression I'd just experienced. People entering the cave, documenting the tunnels and chambers, reaching the central lake, and then the later photos showed them from angles they hadn't taken themselves. Pictures of them sleeping in the deeper chambers, eating food that wasn't quite food, their skin taking on a pale, phosphorescent glow. And in the final photos of each series, they weren't alone. The pale entities were with them, guiding them, touching them, changing them. At the far end of the chamber, I found the camera equipment. Dozens of cameras, thousands of dollars worth of professional photography gear, all neatly arranged on stone shelves carved into the cave walls. And sitting among them, a laptop computer displaying what looked like an email inbox. Dr. Harrison's email account, with hundreds of sent messages offering the same cave photography job to different freelancers across Kentucky and surrounding states. Dr. Harrison wasn't a person. Dr. Harrison was them, the entities that lived in this place. They were using human technology to lure photographers into their domain, adding our work to their collection, keeping us as some kind of documentary archive of their existence. I could hear them entering the chamber behind me. When I turned around, there were 6 of them, standing between me and the passage I'd used to enter. Up close, I could see they weren't wearing clothes. Their pale skin was their covering, smooth and slightly luminescent like the cave walls. They were human-shaped but elongated, with joints that bent in directions that human anatomy doesn't allow. Their faces were the worst part. Recognizably human features, arranged in patterns that were almost right but fundamentally wrong. But they weren't threatening me. They were just watching, waiting, with expressions that might have been curious, or patient, or something else entirely. One of them was holding a camera, not one of the older models from the equipment shelves, but a recent digital SLR that looked exactly like the one I'd lost when my car was robbed. They had been watching me long before I ever received that email. The entity with my camera pointed toward the computer, then back at me, then at one of the empty spaces on the equipment shelves. The message was clear. I could join their collection, become part of their documentation project, or I ran, not toward the passage they were blocking, but toward what looked like a natural crack in the chamber wall. It was barely wide enough for my body, and I had to abandon most of my camera equipment to squeeze through. But it opened into a narrow vertical shaft that led upward. I could hear them trying to follow, but they were too large for the opening, and their altered anatomy couldn't navigate the tight space the way a normal human body could. I climbed for what felt like hours, following the shaft as it angled and twisted through the rock. The phosphorescent glow faded as I went higher, and eventually I was back to using my headlamp and feeling actual cool cave air on my face. When I finally emerged, I was about half a mile from where I'd originally entered the cave, in a small opening hidden by fallen trees and overgrown with bushes. My truck was still parked where I'd left it, and my phone had signal again. I drove straight home without stopping, and I didn't sleep for 3 days. The $5,000 payment appeared in my bank account the next morning, along with the promised bonus. When I tried to reply to Dr. Harrison's email, it bounced back as undeliverable. The email address had never existed. I never went back for my camera equipment. I told myself it wasn't worth the risk, but honestly, I was too terrified to even drive past the area where I'd parked that day. I bought new gear with the money they'd paid me, cheaper equipment that would do the job but wasn't worth anyone's time to steal. That was 3 months ago. Sophia and I moved to Nashville last week. I told her it was for better work opportunities, which is partly true, but mainly, I needed to be somewhere far from those hills, somewhere with enough people and lights and noise that I could forget the sound of whispered conversations in languages that predated human speech. I still do photography, mostly portrait work now. Nothing that requires me to be alone in remote locations, nothing underground. And sometimes, when I'm reviewing photos on my computer late at night, I find images I don't remember taking. Pictures of cave walls, phosphorescent minerals, pale shapes standing in tunnel mouths. They're still documenting my life. And every few weeks, I get a call on my phone from a number I don't recognize. When I answer, all I hear is that same subsonic whispering, patient and eternal, inviting me to return and finish the work I started. I keep telling myself that moving to Nashville was the right choice, that Sophia's safer here, that we can build a normal life in the city. But sometimes, when the lights are off and the apartment is quiet, I can feel the walls pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm like breathing. And I know that no matter how far I run, some places never really let you leave. I'm 23 years old, and I deliver pizzas for Gino's in Charleston, West Virginia. Not exactly the career I had planned, but after my sister Emma died in that car accident last spring, I had to drop out of school and find work fast. The funeral costs wiped out what little savings our family had, and honestly, I just needed something that kept me moving. Sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering that I was the one who was supposed to pick her up that night. The pizza delivery job wasn't glamorous, but it paid decent enough, especially with tips from the late-night runs. I was saving every penny I could toward mechanic school. Emma always said I had good hands for fixing things. She used to sit in the garage with me when I worked on my old Civic, asking a million questions about engines and transmissions. "You're gonna have your own shop someday, Tyler," she'd say, spinning around on Dad's rolling stool. "And I'll be your first customer when I get my license." She never got that license. Most of my deliveries stayed within Charleston or the immediate suburbs, but occasionally we'd get orders from way out in the hills. The older drivers usually grabbed those runs because the tips were better. Folks out there appreciated the effort it took to find their place. But on this particular Tuesday night in October, everyone else had either gone home or was handling closer orders. So when the ticket came in for Devil's Creek, I took it. Devil's Creek wasn't really a town, more like a collection of hollers and ridges about 40 minutes east of Charleston. The order was for 2 large pepperoni pizzas. Total came to $38, and the customer had specifically requested me to call when I got close, instead of trying to find the house number. That wasn't unusual for rural deliveries. Half the places out there didn't have proper addresses, just directions like, turn at the big oak tree, or follow the gravel road past the Hendersons' old place. The customer, who'd given his name as Mr. Davidson, had left detailed handwritten directions with the order. His voice on the phone had been soft, almost whispery, but he'd been polite enough and said he'd tip well for the trouble of coming out so far. I needed that tip money. Emma's medical bills were still trickling in, even 4 months after the accident, and every extra dollar helped. I loaded up my Honda around 11:30 p.m. and headed out of town. The first part of the drive was familiar. State Route 60 east toward the mountains, past the Walmart and the gas stations and the last few streetlights. After that, it was just me and the winding 2-lane road that cut through the hollers. The radio worked fine for the first 20 minutes, playing that classic rock station Emma used to love. But as I got deeper into the hills, the signal started breaking up into static. The GPS on my phone held out a little longer, but somewhere around the turnoff onto Route 23, it just went dark. The screen stayed lit, but the little blue dot that showed my location disappeared, and when I tried to refresh it, the app just said, "GPS signal not found." I wasn't too worried. I had Mr. Davidson's handwritten directions, and they seemed clear enough. Turn left at Sawyer's Road, follow it for 6 miles, then look for a mailbox with a red flag. But as I drove deeper into Devil's Creek, following those directions, something started feeling off. The roads got narrower and more twisted than I remembered from previous deliveries out here. The trees seemed to press closer to the asphalt, their branches forming a canopy so thick that my headlights barely penetrated more than 50 feet ahead. And it was quiet in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. No insects chirping, no owls hooting, nothing but the sound of my engine and tires on the road. I'd been driving for almost an hour when I finally spotted what looked like the place, an old BP station with the lights off and weeds growing up through cracks in the concrete. But there were people there, silhouetted against my headlights as I pulled into the lot. Kids, actually. 3 of them, standing in a little cluster near where the gas pumps used to be. The oldest looked maybe 14, a boy with shaggy dark hair wearing clothes that seemed too big for him. Next to him stood a girl who couldn't have been more than 10, and beside her, the smallest one, another girl, maybe 8 years old, with blonde hair that caught the light from my headlights. They watched my car approach with the kind of stillness that immediately put me on edge. Not the excited energy you'd expect from kids waiting for pizza, but something more cautious, almost predatory. As I parked and turned off the engine, I could see they were barefoot, all 3 of them, despite the October chill that had me wearing a jacket. The oldest boy stepped forward as I got out, and I could see him clutching a handful of crumpled bills and coins. "You the pizza man?" he asked, and his voice had that same soft, whispery quality I'd heard on the phone. "Yeah, I'm Tyler from Gino's," I said, opening the back door to get the pizzas. "2 large pepperonis, right? That'll be $38. The kids huddled together, counting their money, and I got a closer look at them. Their clothes weren't just big, they looked handmade, like someone had sewn them from old fabric and blankets. The girls wore simple dresses that hung loose on their thin frames, and the boy had on pants that were held up with rope instead of a belt. But it was the youngest girl who really caught my attention. When she looked up at me, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. She had the same blonde hair as Emma, the same blue eyes, even the same shy smile that tugged up more on one side than the other. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. "We got the money," the boy said, holding out his handful of cash. "Mama sent us to get the food. She's real grateful you came all this way." I took the money and counted it quickly. $38 exactly, all in small bills and quarters. No tip, but that was okay. These kids looked like they needed the pizza more than I needed the extra few bucks. "Where's your mom?" I asked, handing over the pizza boxes. "Back at camp," the middle girl said. "She's waiting to thank the food bringer." The way she said food bringer instead of delivery guy struck me as odd, but I was still focused on the youngest girl. She was staring at me with those Emma blue eyes, and when she smiled again, it was exactly the same expression my sister used to make when she was trying to convince me to let her help with whatever I was working on. "You look sad," the little girl said suddenly. "Are you sad about your sister?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest. I hadn't mentioned Emma to anyone, and there was no way these kids could know about her. But before I could ask how she knew that, the boy was talking again. "Mama really wants to meet you," he said. "She says you're special, says you understand about family." Every instinct I had was telling me to get back in my car and leave, but I couldn't stop looking at the little girl. She had tilted her head to one side, just like Emma used to do when she was thinking, and she was humming something under her breath. It took me a moment to recognize the tune. It was Danny's song, the Kenny Loggins song that Emma used to sing along with on the radio. "What's your name, sweetheart?" I asked the little girl. "Lucy," she said, and even her voice carried the same shy musicality that Emma's had. Mama says, I remind people of their little sisters. The middle girl tugged on my jacket sleeve. Mama's waiting, she said. She don't like when people keep her waiting too long. I should have left. I should have gotten in my car and driven straight back to Charleston and never thought about these kids again. But Lucy was still humming Emma's song, and when she reached out and took my hand, her small fingers were cold in exactly the same way Emma's always were. Come meet Mama, Lucy said. She's been waiting for you for a real long time. Against every rational thought in my head, I let them lead me away from my car and into the woods behind the abandoned gas station. The boy carried both pizza boxes, and the girls walked on either side of me, Lucy still holding my hand. The trees were so thick that I lost sight of the gas station within 50 yards, and the only light came from a faint orange glow somewhere ahead of us. We walked for maybe 10 minutes along what might have once been a trail, stepping over fallen logs and pushing through overgrown brush. The glow got brighter as we got closer, and eventually I could see it was coming from a campfire. Around it, I could make out the shapes of several tents and a larger structure that looked like it had been built from salvaged materials. Plywood, tarps, and pieces of metal roofing, all held together with rope and wire. And sitting beside the fire was a woman. She looked to be in her 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a loose bun and clothes that were clean but worn. When she saw us approaching, she stood up and smiled, and there was something about that smile that made my skin crawl. It was too wide, too knowing, like she was looking at something behind my eyes instead of at me. Tyler, she said, and her voice was warm and welcoming in a way that felt completely wrong. I'm so glad you could come. The children have been so excited to meet you. How do you know my name? I asked, but she was already moving toward me with her arms outstretched like she wanted to hug me. I know lots of things about you, honey, she said. I know about Emma. I know how much you miss her. I know how guilty you feel. I stepped back, bumping into Lucy, who was still holding my hand. I don't understand. How could you possibly know about my sister? The woman, Mama, as the kids called her, gestured toward a log that had been arranged as a seat near the fire. Sit down, Tyler. Let me show you something. I wanted to run, but Lucy was looking up at me with Emma's eyes, and the other children had arranged themselves around the fire like they were settling in for story time. The boy set the pizza boxes on a makeshift table, and I could smell the pepperoni mixing with the wood smoke and something else, something sweet and cloying that I couldn't identify. Mama disappeared into the larger structure and came back carrying a cardboard box. She set it down beside the fire and opened it, pulling out what looked like photographs. I've been watching you, Tyler, she said, handing me the first photo. It was a picture of me standing beside Emma's grave, taken from a distance but clearly showing my face. I was holding the flowers I'd brought for what would have been her 17th birthday. You visit her every week. Every Sunday afternoon, you bring fresh flowers and you sit there for exactly 23 minutes. The next photo showed me leaving the cemetery, and the one after that was taken through the window of my apartment. I could see myself sitting on my couch, holding one of Emma's old teddy bears and crying. How long have you been watching me? I asked. But my voice came out as barely a whisper. Since the accident, Mama said softly. I read about it in the paper. Such a tragedy, a young girl dying so close to her birthday, and her big brother blaming himself for not being there to drive her home from that party. Lucy squeezed my hand tighter. Don't be sad, she said. Mama can fix sad. That's right, honey, Mama said, reaching over to stroke Lucy's blonde hair. I can fix all kinds of broken things. Broken hearts, broken families. I've been doing it for years. She pulled out more photos, and my blood went cold. They showed other men and women, all around my age, all looking devastated. And in each photo, there were children who looked eerily similar to whoever the adult was grieving. This is Marcus, Mama said, pointing to a photo of a heavy-set man in his 30s holding hands with a little boy. He lost his son in a drowning accident. And this is Sarah. Her daughter died of leukemia. They all found what they were looking for here. Where are they now? I asked. Mama's smile never wavered. They're with their families. Forever. She gestured toward a section of the woods behind the camp, where I could now make out several small mounds of earth. Some had makeshift crosses, others just stones to mark them. You're insane, I said, starting to stand up, but Lucy tugged on my hand. "Don't go yet," she said. "We haven't had our family dinner." Before I could respond, the other children had moved to block my path back toward the gas station. They weren't threatening, exactly, but their message was clear. I wasn't leaving yet. "Lucy here has been practicing so hard to be your little sister," Mama said, pulling the little girl onto her lap. "Show Tyler what you've learned, sweetie." Lucy took a deep breath and started talking, but it wasn't her voice that came out. It was Emma's voice, with Emma's slight lisp and the way she always emphasized the wrong syllables in big words. "Tyler, remember when we used to play cards on rainy days?" Lucy said in Emma's voice. "And you always let me win at Go Fish because you said I made the best celebration dance?" I felt like I was going to throw up. Emma and I had played cards dozens of times, and I had always let her win. And she did have a ridiculous celebration dance that involved spinning around and pumping her fists in the air. "How does she know that?" I whispered. "I told you, I've been watching," Mama said. "I studied Emma's old videos on social media. I watched how she moved, how she talked, how she laughed. Lucy's been practicing for months." Lucy giggled, and it was Emma's giggle, the one that always made me smile no matter how bad my day had been. But coming from this stranger's mouth, it was the most horrifying sound I'd ever heard. "The other children have been practicing too," Mama continued. "Tommy here has been learning to be the little brother you never had, and Sarah has been working on being your twin sister. We can be the family that Emma's death took away from you." The boy, Tommy, stepped forward and grinned at me. "Want to teach me how to work on cars, big brother? I've been reading all about engines. And I can help you with your homework," the middle girl, Sarah, added. Just like Emma used to. I realized then what this was. This woman had been stalking my grief, studying every detail of my relationship with Emma, and she'd trained these children to role-play my dead sister and the siblings I'd never had. It was psychological kidnapping, using my own trauma as the trap. "You can visit Emma whenever you want," Mama said softly. "All you have to do is stay, be part of our family, help me take care of the children. And if I don't," her smile faded slightly, "well, that would be disappointing, especially for Lucy. She's worked so hard to become Emma for you." Lucy looked up at me with tears in her blue eyes. "Please don't leave me again, Tyler," she said in Emma's voice. "I've been waiting for you." That's when I noticed how thin Lucy was. All the children were too skinny, but Lucy looked almost skeletal under her loose dress. Her skin had a grayish pallor, and now that I was paying attention, I could hear a slight wheeze in her breathing. "When's the last time you took her to a doctor?" I asked. "Doctors ask too many questions," Mama said. "Lucy doesn't need a doctor. She just needs her big brother." As if summoned by my concern, Lucy suddenly went rigid and started shaking. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she made a choking sound as her whole body convulsed. "She's having a seizure," I shouted, but Mama just held her tighter. "Emma used to have episodes like this," Mama said calmly. "Remember Tyler? Right before the accident, she was having health problems." That was a lie. Emma had never had seizures or any serious health problems. This little girl was dying, and this crazy woman was using it as part of her sick fantasy. "She needs a hospital," I said, reaching for Lucy. But the other children moved to block me. "Emma can't go to the hospital," Tommy said. "If she goes to the hospital, she'll die again." Lucy's seizure was getting worse. Foam was coming from her mouth, and her skin was turning blue. Without thinking, I shoved Tommy aside and grabbed Lucy from Mama's arms. "You're killing her," I yelled. "I saved her," Mama screamed back. "Just like I saved all of them. They were lost and forgotten, and I gave them purpose." I started running toward where I thought the gas station was, carrying Lucy. But the other children chased after me, crying and begging me not to take Emma away. In the darkness, I got turned around and found myself deeper in the woods, Lucy growing heavier in my arms as her breathing became more labored. "Lucy," I whispered, looking down at her pale face. "Your real name is Lucy, right? Not Emma. Emma was my sister, and she died, and that's not your fault." For just a moment, Lucy's eyes focused on mine, and I saw a flicker of recognition. I want to go home," she whispered in her own voice. "I want my real mommy." Behind us, I could hear Mama crashing through the underbrush, screaming that I was murdering her daughter. The other children were crying and calling for Emma to come back. But I kept running, following what I hoped was the right direction, until I finally saw the glow of my headlights through the trees. I got Lucy to the hospital in Charleston just in time. She was severely malnourished and had developed pneumonia from living in those cold, damp conditions. While the doctors worked on her, I called the police and told them everything I could remember about the location of the camp. It took them 3 days to find the place, and when they did, they discovered 6 more children, all malnourished and all trained to impersonate dead family members of grieving parents. They found the graves too. 4 adults who had apparently decided they couldn't live without their artificial families and had taken poison that Mama provided. Mama herself was never found. The children said she disappeared into the woods that night and never came back. Lucy recovered, and the police were able to reunite her with her real family. She'd been taken from a grocery store parking lot in Ohio 2 years earlier. Her parents had never stopped looking for her. She sends me a letter every few months now, just to let me know she's okay and back in school and learning to be herself again instead of someone else's dead sister. I still deliver pizzas, but I never take runs to Devil's Creek anymore. I'm halfway through mechanic school now, paying for it with the reward money from helping the police find that operation. And I finally started going to grief counseling, learning how to miss Emma without letting that grief consume my whole life. The thing that still haunts me isn't the supernatural stuff. It's how badly I wanted to believe that little girl really was Emma. For those few minutes by the fire, listening to Lucy talk in my sister's voice, part of me was ready to stay, ready to give up everything just to pretend my sister was still alive. Grief makes you vulnerable in ways you can't imagine until you're drowning in it. And there are people out there who know how to use that vulnerability as a weapon. Mama understood that the deepest horror isn't monsters or ghosts. It's the human capacity to exploit love and loss for our own twisted purposes. I still visit Emma's grave every Sunday, but now I bring Lucy's letters and read them out loud. I tell Emma about how her fake sister is doing, and how learning to save Lucy taught me that I couldn't save Emma, but I could still save myself. It's not the family reunion I dreamed about, but it's real, and that matters more than I used to think it did. I'm 44 years old, and I've been driving a school bus through the mountains of rural Virginia for 15 years now. My name's Linda Foster, and honestly, after everything I've been through, I probably should have retired by now. But I can't. Not when I've got my twin grandsons to raise, Jake and Tommy, they're 12, and not after what happened on that special route I took up Panther Mountain. I'm their only family left since my daughter Sarah passed from an overdose 3 years back. The boys don't talk about their mama much, but I see her in their eyes sometimes, especially when they think I'm not looking. I took that extra route for the overtime money, if I'm being honest. Social Security doesn't stretch far enough for 3 people, and growing boys eat like there's no tomorrow. The school district offered me additional pay for what they called private transportation services. Picking up homeschool kids from remote areas whose parents paid the district directly for bus service seemed reasonable enough. I'd been driving these mountain roads since before most folks had GPS, so a few extra stops in exchange for an extra $150 a week. I needed that money. The route supervisor, Mr. Henderson, handed me 3 new addresses on a Tuesday morning in October. Said the parents had specifically requested me because I'd been driving longest and knew the back roads better than anyone. Made sense. Some of these haulers don't even show up on maps, just old logging roads that wind so deep into the mountains you lose cell service after the first mile. I'd grown up in these parts, learned to drive on roads that were barely more than deer paths, so navigating the remote pickups didn't worry me none. What should have worried me was how eager Mr. Henderson seemed to get these kids on my route. He kept saying how important it was that these particular children got proper transportation and how their parents were very concerned about their safety. At the time, I thought he meant bears or rough roads. Looking back now, I think he knew more than he was letting on. The first pickup was Amy, who I guessed to be about 13. She stood at the end of a gravel road that disappeared into thick pine forest, wearing what looked like handmade clothes, a plain brown dress that went down to her ankles, and a heavy wool sweater despite the mild October weather. She climbed onto the bus without saying a word, chose a seat near the front, and kept her hands folded in her lap. When I tried to make conversation, asked her what grade she was in, what subjects she liked, she just nodded politely, but wouldn't really answer. Her eyes kept darting to the mirrors, watching the road behind us like she expected someone to be following. The second stop was for Peter, maybe 11 years old, who stood at another isolated road junction wearing identical brown clothes. Same quiet demeanor, same watchful behavior. But Peter had something Amy didn't. I could see old break lines in his arm, the kind you get when bones heal wrong without proper medical care. My Sarah had broken her wrist falling off her bike when she was about Peter's age, and I remembered exactly what those healing lines looked like on the x-rays. Peter's arm had definitely been broken, probably more than once, and whoever had treated it hadn't bothered with doctors or hospitals. The third child was the youngest, a little girl named Emma who couldn't have been more than 9. She had the same handmade brown dress, the same fearful eyes, but Emma had something else that made my grandmother instincts kick into high gear. Burn marks on her hands, small circular scars that looked deliberate. When she climbed onto the bus, she flinched when I spoke to her, actually ducked like she expected me to hit her. In 15 years of driving school buses, I'd seen plenty of kids from rough homes, but these 3 were different. They weren't just shy or antisocial, they were genuinely afraid. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to my 3 special passengers. They never had backpacks, notebooks, or any kind of school supplies. They couldn't read the safety signs on the bus, but Emma could identify every edible plant we passed through the windows. Peter knew exactly which berries were safe to eat and which would make you sick, but he couldn't add simple numbers when I tried to help him count his fingers. Amy could tell me which direction we were heading without looking at a compass, could predict weather changes hours before they happened, but she'd never heard of basic things like the alphabet song or nursery rhymes. Most unsettling was how they communicated with each other. They'd whisper in what sounded like a mixture of English and something else, not Spanish or any language I recognized, but something that sounded almost like old mountain dialect mixed with words I'd never heard. They'd point at landmarks and murmur to each other, always keeping their voices so low I couldn't make out individual words. But their body language was clear. They were scared, constantly watching, always prepared to run. The route took me deeper into Panther Mountain than I'd driven in years, past abandoned mining equipment and old logging camps that hadn't been active since my daddy's time. The roads got narrower and more isolated with each pickup, until I was driving paths that barely qualified as roads at all. No other houses, no mailboxes, no signs of normal human habitation. Just thick forest, steep ridges, and an uncomfortable feeling that I was being watched from the tree line. It was Emma who finally started talking to me, maybe 3 weeks into the route. She'd been drawing pictures during the rides, not with crayons or colored pencils, but with charcoal she'd somehow gotten hold of. The pictures showed groups of adults in military-style clothing, carrying weapons, and smaller figures that looked like children hiding in dark spaces. When I asked her about the drawings, she whispered that they were pictures of family gathering time and that she didn't want to go back for the next one. "What's family gathering time, honey?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle like I used when my grandsons had nightmares. Emma glanced at Amy and Peter before answering. "That's when the grown-ups decide which kids aren't strong enough yet. The weak ones have to do extra training until they get better, or..." She didn't finish the sentence, but her small hand moved unconsciously to one of the burn scars on her wrist. That's when Amy finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Linda, the grown-ups say the world's gonna end soon, and only the strong ones will survive. They're teaching us to be ready, but..." She hesitated, looking around the bus like she expected someone to be listening. "But some kids don't come back from training. They say those kids got sent to other families, but Emma heard crying from the punishment shed last time, and now Marcus isn't with us anymore." My blood went cold. In 15 years of working with children, I'd learned to recognize the signs of abuse, and everything about these 3 kids screamed danger. The identical clothes, the isolation, the fear, the burns and broken bones. This wasn't homeschooling. This was something much worse. I started taking different routes home after dropping them off, trying to get a better look at where these children actually lived. Following the gravel road past Amy's pickup point, I discovered it led to a large compound hidden deep in the mountain hollow. From a distance, using binoculars my late husband had left behind, I could see military-style buildings, obstacle courses, and adults dressed in camouflage conducting what looked like combat drills. There were dozens of children visible, all wearing the same brown clothing, all moving in organized formations like they were soldiers instead of kids. The adults carried rifles and had communication equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything the local sheriff's department owned. They'd set up guard posts around the perimeter and had cameras mounted on trees. This wasn't just some survivalist family living off the grid. This was an organized compound with serious security measures and a lot of people who seemed to be preparing for some kind of war. I started documenting what I saw, taking pictures when I could, and keeping notes about the children's behavior and conditions. Emma continued drawing her pictures, and I started keeping them instead of letting her throw them away. Peter began telling me about training exercises that involved children fighting each other with wooden weapons until someone got hurt badly enough to quit. Amy described living in dormitories separated from the adults, eating one meal a day, and spending most of their time learning combat techniques, weapons handling, and survival skills. The more I learned, the more horrified I became. These children weren't being educated, they were being turned into child soldiers for some survivalist group that believed civilization was about to collapse. The adults called themselves preparers and claimed they were saving the children from the weakness of modern society. But what they were really doing was systematic child abuse, disguised as training for an apocalypse that existed only in their paranoid fantasies. Everything changed the day Amy climbed onto the bus with fresh bruises on her neck and terror in her eyes. She sat down next to me instead of in her usual seat and whispered, "Miss Linda, they know you've been watching. They're coming to talk to you about your grandsons." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "They found out about Jake and Tommy. They say city boys are weak and need proper training before the collapse comes. They want to invite your family to join ours." Amy's voice was shaking. "Miss Linda, you can't let them take your boys. They'll do to them what they did to us." That afternoon, 2 men in military fatigues showed up at my house. They were polite, even charming, but everything about them set off alarm bells. They introduced themselves as community coordinators and explained that they represented a group of families who were preparing their children for the inevitable societal breakdown that was coming. They'd heard I was a widow raising grandsons alone and thought I might be interested in their educational program. "Mrs. Foster," the taller one said, "we've been watching how well you handle our children on the bus route. You clearly care about kids' safety and well-being, but traditional schools are making children soft and vulnerable. Look what happened to your daughter. Society failed her, didn't it? Drugs, violence, moral decay. We can prevent that from happening to Jake and Tommy." They knew about Sarah's overdose. They'd researched my family, probably knew more about my personal life than I was comfortable with. They presented statistics about urban crime, social collapse, and economic instability, painting a picture of a world spiraling toward chaos. They offered to take my grandsons into their educational program where they'd learn real survival skills instead of useless academic subjects that won't matter when the grid goes down. "Think about it," the shorter man added. "Wouldn't you rather have them prepared to survive anything instead of dependent on a system that's already failing? We can give them the strength your daughter never had." I thanked them politely and said I'd consider their offer, but inside, I was terrified. These people had been studying my family, and they clearly weren't going to take no for an answer easily. After they left, I called my grandsons into the living room and told them we needed to have a serious talk about stranger safety and what to do if anyone ever approached them about special programs or training. The next day on the bus, Amy grabbed my arm as soon as I picked her up. "They're planning something," she whispered urgently. "Emma heard them talking about the Foster extraction tonight. They think you're going to cause problems, so they want to take Jake and Tommy before you can stop them." "What do you mean, extraction?" "They take children in the middle of the night," Peter said quietly. "They did it to me. My mom thought I was kidnapped, but they told me she'd agreed to let them train me. By the time she figured out the truth, I was already here, and they said I belonged to the family now." Emma started crying. "Miss Linda, they're going to take your grandsons tonight and bring them to the compound. Once kids get there, they never leave. Please don't let them take Jake and Tommy." I realized these children weren't just victims, they were prisoners. And now my own grandsons were being targeted for recruitment into what was essentially a survivalist cult that used child soldiers as their preparation for an imaginary apocalypse. That's when Amy told me something that changed everything. "Miss Linda, we've been planning to escape for months. We know all the guard schedules and where they keep the vehicles. But we need help from someone who knows the mountain roads better than they do. If you help us get out tonight, We can all disappear before they can take your grandsons. It was the most dangerous decision I'd ever made. But looking at those 3 terrified children, I knew I didn't have a choice. We worked out a plan during the remainder of that bus route. The compound had a shift change at 2 a.m. when the night guards got tired and the day guards weren't fully alert yet. Amy knew which children were planning to escape and where they'd meet. My job was to get a school bus close enough to the compound to pick them up, then drive them to safety before the adults realized what was happening. I called in sick the next day and spent the afternoon preparing. I filled the bus with extra fuel, packed emergency supplies, and made sure my cell phone was fully charged. I called my neighbor Mrs. Patterson and asked her to keep an eye on Jake and Tommy, telling her there might be some strange people looking for me but that I'd be back by morning. I didn't tell her the whole truth. It would have sounded too crazy to believe. At 1:30 a.m., I drove the bus up the mountain using back roads I'd learned as a teenager, paths that were barely wide enough for the vehicle but kept me away from the compound's main security positions. Amy had described a service road that connected to the main compound from the east, used for supply deliveries but not heavily guarded at night. My plan was to park there and wait for the children to reach me. The service road was exactly where Amy said it would be, hidden behind a stand of pine trees and marked only by a rusted sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." I parked the bus facing downhill for a quick escape and turned off the engine, sitting in the darkness and listening to the mountain night sounds while I waited. At exactly 2:15 a.m., I heard movement in the trees. Amy appeared first, leading a group of 6 other children ranging in age from about 8 to 14. They moved silently, keeping low and using hand signals to communicate. Behind them came Peter and Emma with 4 more kids, including one boy who looked like he could barely walk but was being helped by the others. "Hurry," Amy whispered as they climbed onto the bus. "They'll notice we're missing when they do the 3 a.m. count." I counted 12 children total, all wearing the same brown homemade clothes, all looking terrified but determined. The boy who was having trouble walking had been beaten recently. His face was swollen and he moved like his ribs were injured. Emma sat next to him and held his hand while I started the engine and began driving down the mountain as quietly as possible. We made it about halfway down before the compound's alarm system started blaring. Spotlights came on behind us, and I could see vehicles beginning to pursue us through the rearview mirror. The children huddled down in their seats while I pushed the bus as fast as I dared on the narrow mountain roads. "They have radios," Amy called from the front seat. "They're going to try to cut us off at the bottom of the mountain." I knew these roads better than anyone who'd moved to the area in the last 20 years, so I took a route I'd learned during my teenage years when kids used to party in the abandoned mining camps. It was a logging road that connected to the main highway about 10 miles south of where they'd expect us to emerge. Rough and steep, but wide enough for the bus if I was careful. The road was worse than I remembered. Deep ruts, fallen trees, and creek crossings that hadn't been maintained in decades. But the bus held together, and more importantly, it was a route the compound's drivers wouldn't know. By the time we reached the main highway, we'd lost our pursuers, and I was able to drive straight to the state police barracks in the county seat. The desk sergeant initially didn't believe our story. It sounded too extreme, too organized, too much like something from a movie. But when he saw 12 traumatized children with matching clothes and obvious signs of abuse, he started making phone calls. By dawn, we had FBI agents, social workers, and child protection services surrounding us with questions and documentation. The raid on the compound happened 2 days later. They found evidence of systematic child abuse, weapons violations, tax evasion, and kidnapping. 37 children were removed from the compound and placed in protective custody. Most of the adults were arrested, though some of the leaders escaped into the deep mountains and were never caught. The compound itself was shut down, and the property was seized by the federal government. Amy, Peter, and Emma ended up in my care through the foster system while their cases were sorted out. It turned out Peter had been taken from his mother 4 years earlier. Emma had been born at the compound and had never lived in the outside world, and Amy's parents had died in what the cult called a training accident when she was 8. None of them had birth certificates, medical records, or any documentation of their existence. It took months of therapy and specialized education to help them adjust to normal life. Emma had to learn to read and write from scratch. Peter needed medical care for his poorly healed bones and extensive dental work. Amy had nightmares for over a year and couldn't sleep without checking all the locks on the doors and windows. But they adapted, slowly but surely, to living in a world where children didn't have to fight to prove their worthiness to survive. The other 9 children who escaped with us were eventually reunited with their families or placed in appropriate foster care. Some had been reported missing years earlier, others were thought to have died in accidents. The FBI investigation revealed that the compound had been operating for over 15 years, moving locations several times as authorities got close to discovering them. Jake and Tommy never knew how close they came to being taken. I told them we'd had some trouble with strangers asking about them, but I never explained the full details. They're 17 now, seniors in high school, and they think their biggest worries are college applications and getting driver's licenses. I'm grateful they get to worry about normal teenage things, instead of whether they're strong enough to survive in a post-apocalyptic world that existed only in sick minds. I kept driving school buses for 3 more years after that, but I never took special routes again. Every time Mr. Henderson suggested additional pickups in remote areas, I politely declined and recommended other drivers. Some experiences change you permanently, and after living through what those children had endured, I never wanted to risk missing signs of abuse again. Amy graduated from high school last year and is studying social work at the community college. She wants to help other children who've been through trauma, and I couldn't be prouder of her. Peter is a junior now, excelling in auto mechanics and planning to open his own garage someday. Emma is a freshman who reads everything she can get her hands on. She says she's still making up for all the years she couldn't read. They're my kids now, officially adopted, and they've given Jake and Tommy the siblings they never knew they needed. To this day, I don't drive up Panther Mountain unless I absolutely have to. The compound is gone, the buildings torn down, and the land returned to forest. But I still get an uncomfortable feeling when I pass those old logging roads. I know most of the cult leaders were caught eventually, but some of them are still out there, probably starting over somewhere else with new families and new children to prepare for their imaginary apocalypse. I'm 59 now, retired from bus driving but not from protecting children. I volunteer with the county's Child Protective Services, helping to identify signs of abuse and neglect that others might miss. Every time I meet a child who seems too quiet, too fearful, or too trained in survival skills that kids shouldn't need to know, I remember Amy, Peter, and Emma climbing onto my bus that October morning, and I make sure someone investigates. The most important thing I learned from all of this is that evil doesn't always look like monsters or strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes it looks like concerned adults who claim they're protecting children by preparing them for dangers that exist only in paranoid fantasies. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who believe their abuse is actually love, their control is actually education, and their fear is actually wisdom. But I also learned that children are stronger and braver than most adults give them credit for. Amy, Peter, and Emma survived years of systematic abuse and still found the courage to escape and help others escape with them. They saved not just themselves, but 9 other children, and indirectly saved my grandsons from being taken. They're heroes, even though they'd never call themselves that. These days, when I tuck Emma in at night or watch Peter work on his car projects, or listen to Amy talk about her classes, I'm reminded that the best way to prepare children for an uncertain world isn't to make them hard and fearful. It's to give them love, education, and the confidence that comes from knowing they're valued for who they are, not for how well they can fight or survive imaginary disasters. The nightmares have mostly stopped, but I still check all the locks before bed, and I still keep my phone charged in case someone needs help. Some habits from that time have never faded, but mostly, I sleep well, knowing that 4 children who might have been lost forever are safe in their beds, down the hall, dreaming about normal things like homework and friends and futures that don't involve preparing for the end of the world.